Well, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Let's get things kicked off. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Susan Ram, and I'm the Vice President of Publisher and Platform Sales here at Upwave. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to our 2022 Q1 Masters of Brand Measurement event, The Future of TV Measurement. Some of you may have remembered our gathering in New York City just before the global pandemic, where we spoke with these same industry experts on how they envisioned the future of TV measurement. Needless to say, the next 2 years would impact the landscape more than anyone could have ever predicted at that time. We've invited the same thought leaders back to a now virtual event, a sign of our times, to see how their predictions have changed, what things have stayed the same, and how they envision the next progression of TV measurement in the years ahead. Our Masters of Brand Measurement events are all about promoting thought leadership within our industry, while also providing networking opportunities for all of us in our brand-focused community. A quick reminder to some of you, we are Upwave, the analytics platform for brand advertising. We make your brand marketing more impactful. If you're not familiar with us, please reach out and we look forward to connecting. A huge thank you to both our industry experts who've joined our panel today, as well as all of you who are attending the event. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, SVP of Customer Success and Analytics, John Stewart. John will get our panel introduced, our topics for discussion kicked off, and thanks again so much for joining us today. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Susan. So before we get going here, it's worth mentioning that in our 2020 session, we had panelists Amy Cassell from Roku, Heidi Miller from Media Hub, Jessica Hogue from Innovid, but unfortunately, they were not able to join due to scheduling, but we did reach out to get some insights from them, which we'll share throughout this webinar. So now I'll introduce you to our returning masters who are going to talk about the future of TV measurement. Devin Fallon, if you want to join us on video. Devin comes to us from Vizio.
Hi, John. Devin Fallon. I head up the Media Insights and Analytics team over at Vizio Ads.
And next up, we have Bob Ivins from TV Squared.
Hey, John. Thanks for having us. Bob Ivins, Chief Strategy Officer, TV Squared, cross-platform TV measurement and attribution company.
And George Musi from IPG Health.
Hello, everyone. George Musi, IPG Health. I lead a portfolio of agencies that focus on data analytics, technology, consultancy, and media. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you guys on board. And what we're going to do this time is we're going to kick off the Q&A by showing you guys some of the same questions we asked during our March 2020 session, with some highlighted quotes from our masters that were quotable at that time. And so the first question that we want to discuss is marketer pain points. So as we think about the challenge of marketers when we think about TV, and specifically since 2020, maybe in a in a post-pandemic or hopefully a post-pandemic world, what's on marketers' wish list for better advanced TV measurement, and what are some of the pain points to be solved? Bob, do you want to kick us off here?
Yeah, I think my quote was the one in the middle there, so I'm going to go with that one. I think, between the event that we did 2 years ago and today, I think what has happened is that the TV accelerated how it was changing and transforming. I don't think any of us really would have thought that TV would have moved to CTV so fast. That it was kind of there and bubbling up, but the adoption, the number of services, the time spent with CTV has been incredibly fast in terms of the last 2 years. I think that's one thing. I also think that there's a recognition now for the marketers that we are moving from an environment where we're measuring ad exposure using a proxy, which is program viewership, to really currency grade household level impressions data across platforms. So I think those two things have been really what I've seen in the industry in the last 2 years.
Excellent. And Devin, what are you seeing from the, from your perspective, and I guess from Vizio?
So I think, John, I had weighed in around the degree of data and the consistency of data in my last visit. And I think there's still a lot to unpack there in terms of how we're unifying across platforms. Bob alluded to this when we're talking about common currencies. I'm fortunate to be at a place now where we have a huge wealth of first-party data available to us, but ultimately we need to find ways to unify that with the source of truth that our individual brand advertisers and agencies are using. And that can sometimes be a limiting factor. So it's a real balancing act for us to leverage as much of our first-party data as possible, particularly around opted-in viewership insights, while still aiming for that unified umbrella approach that clients want to take to a whole campaign, which we certainly understand.
Yeah, it seems to be a I think we always talk about the classic trade-off between all the data available, making it possible for marketers to be very precise, but then there's potentially a challenge of scale, right? So how precise can you be at scale? So George, wanted to get your perspective on this topic as well, and maybe talk a little bit about how that might have evolved since we last spoke.
Thank you. My quote is on the bottom. I think there's probably three big things that have kind of changed, and I think will change again. So for those that are familiar with the diffusion of innovation, Bob kind of alluded to it already. There was always a wait and see in television. Wait and see if something is valuable. Let's wait and see if others do it first, right? So you have those visionaries and those trialists that are pushing the curve a little bit. What, unfortunately, what the big catalyst to shorten that innovation, to really create that catalyst for true behavioral change, which has really driven the seismic shift in television, honestly. That's where you're seeing all this investment go through. It was out of necessity, right? So those people that were the skeptics, those people that were the wait and seers, the people that you generally on the tail end of that adoption curve, all of a sudden got compressed within a short amount of time. And in there, you have massive opportunities for a lot of things, right? A lot of content got created, a lot of consumption was there. A lot of behavior that would probably take a lot more years, maybe 5 to 10 years to happen, transpired in almost 2 years. Some of that is subsiding, right? I think you're starting to see the realities that probably is not going to be, not to say that television itself, how it's being redefined consistently, is going to slow down. But this notion of how much attention and viewership is being paid, how much content is being developed, that to me was sort of an anomaly, and it'll start balancing itself out. The other big thing with that fast adoption and behavioral change happened, it emphasized the necessity of interoperability between elements. It's great that we have all these platforms coming out. It's great that we have all this content coming out. It's great that we have all this ability to really get in front of consumers. But the challenge and therefore the opportunity still lies in our ability to really create a systematic understanding of that viewership, systematic understanding of the totality of value of that creates, right? So, TV right now feels more like a lot of different channels. Well, it feels more like cable was when it fragmented broadcast. So you have all these platforms, channels, apps that keep fragmenting because everybody wants to have a piece of the pie. But then what's going to start happening is you'll start seeing consolidation. Why? Because a lot of these platforms are not interoperable with each other. And therefore, as a marketer or anybody else that's trying to get a unified understanding, becomes almost impossible to do that, and therefore dilutes the value of what you can do. Doesn't mean it's not valuable, but the lesson that we've all learned is it's a lot easier to shift money around when you have intelligence. And it's a lot harder these days because a lot of these platforms don't want to speak with each other, either by design or just it doesn't work. Right? I think that's the biggest thing for me that I've seen in the last 2 years, and I'm starting to see a lot more of it starting to play out. You will still see a evolution of television. I have no doubt about that. You will start seeing a divergence and convergence at the same time. What do I mean by that? You will see a divergence of methodologies, but you will see a convergence of the necessity of companies coming together to create interoperability. Everybody's going to have an angle to how they want to prove value, a methodology, an approach, a technique. But I think what's going to happen is they're just pieces to a puzzle. And the quicker we can accelerate that interoperability, the better it's going to be for everybody.
Yeah, one thing you said, which I'm going to throw my first curveball at you guys, is this idea of the acceleration of both the technology and the content, sort of almost, moved us up a decade in terms of entertainment inside the home, right? And maybe even bringing content back to the living room TV from the devices. That's possible. I may have made that up, but the thing I think about are, things like theatrical releases coming, being released, into the home on the first day and so forth. Do you guys have a perspective on how this might change things for marketers, both in terms of challenge and opportunity?
I'm going to jump in there. I think George said something that was interesting when he compared where we are today to where, with the start of the cable business, and how, the job of the marketer is to find and to follow audiences. And I think, if I go back 2 years ago, I could probably count on one hand how many streaming services I had in my house. And now I probably need 3 hands to do it, because I've, we buy them all and we watch less and less linear TV. I think that to kind of answer your question is the business models are changing. I think movies, theater releases is a great example. I mean, that business disappeared for a year, and all of a sudden those relationships and those rules that were in place, it needs to be in the theater for a certain amount of time before it can get released into video or before it can release to streaming services. And all of a sudden that was upside down because you couldn't wait to have this sitting on a shelf for 6 months with nobody going to the theater. You needed to get it distributed and revenue generated. I don't think that's netted out yet. I think that's still going to take time to work out, but I think certainly those periods are collapsing. My opinion, I don't think theater is going to go back to where it was. One, it was kind of, as much as I love the big screen and the events of going to the movie, it wasn't a great experience, to be honest. It was dirty, you had to pay $10 for a popcorn, $15 for a soda. I think consumers are they vote with their wallets, and I kind of like sitting at home, making my own popcorn and getting a beer. So I think those business models are people that were enemies now need to be frenemies. I think it's going to take a while to work out.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the proliferation of, content of all kinds coming into the living room is going to accelerate that. Okay, so we're going to get into the flip side of all this.
One thing before we go, meet John. I'm gonna throw something of a curveball, right? So I believe that the theater, the way Bob described it, I think that is, although you're gonna have pockets like a Spider-Man, but that's just because there was so much goddamn bent up demand of people not being able to get out of the house, that any exit opportunity was anybody's gonna take it, right? I think the future of theaters, and let's redefine it. The future of experiential, right, is going to be more like what a Ready Player One or what the metaverse is going to be. So I think companies will redefine the way they aggregate people, because part of the theater was about being in a collective, right? yeah, there was popcorn, yeah, there was all that stuff. But Bob was right. That allure was no longer there. That's why you saw theaters many years ago start focusing more on experience than anything else. Comfort, experience, convenience, right? Provide more than just really bad food, honestly, right? And part of the experience was always the allure of food. So every time you go to these more new chains, you have personalized everything, personalized meal, personalized experiences, personalized chairs. That's the experience of it all. People pay for that. That's the same reason why what Bob mentioned about being in the home, because I can customize and personalize my experience because I'm home. I think what you're going to start seeing is the theater transition into more of the metaverse, right? Where you can pick and choose the type of experiences that you have with whom you wanted to have them and still have an immersive experience, which I think theaters are all about anyway. That's going to be really, really, really interesting when it goes down that route, because now you're talking about measuring within platforms, which is always a challenge when you're talking about that type of, because it has to predicate around the agreement across all those entities that would ultimately have to come together to enable something like that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you for that, George. All right, well, before we get into the measurement side of things, we do have a video from Amy Cassell from Roku, who was a panelist before. She is coming to us from the ether.
My name is Amy Cassell. I'm on the ad measurement team at Roku. I know a lot has changed in the past 2 years, to say the least, including marketers' wish lists and pain points when it comes to advanced TV measurement. Marketers are increasingly looking for cross-screen measurement, which isn't necessarily new, but leading marketers are realizing that they need to approach this from a streaming first perspective. Another thing we've seen is that consumer trust is increasingly important as cookies, mobile IDs, IP addresses are going by the wayside, making it critical to partner with companies that build trust through a direct relationship with their customers. And lastly, we've seen a growing trend in the need to tie all activations together to prove brand outcomes, from big brand sponsorships to direct response ads.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, so we've talked a lot about this idea of cross-screen, streaming first, and content delivery. And with that, there's a lot of talk nowadays about outcome metrics instead of delivery metrics, like the old days, right? When we were thinking in terms of reach, frequency, on target, et cetera. What are you guys hearing from marketers about measuring brand outcomes and brand metrics?
I have an opinion about this, given that's what we do for a living, but maybe I should let somebody else go first. I like this game of trying to figure out which quote is mine. I enjoy that. So
I would just briefly chime in, because Bob, definitely curious for your take here. I think this conversation is still just as relevant as it was 2 years ago in terms of the balance between delivery metrics and outcome metrics. It's a conversation we have very frequently with our advertising partners. It is particularly relevant for us because a lot of our targeting tactics do revolve around being able to carve out pockets of incrementality based on the linear activity that we know is happening on our platform. And yet, tying it back to the actual outcomes is arguably more important than ever. It's something that I think we've seen strong success with, even surprising me in terms of how down the funnel we can get with this fundamentally TV-like experience. Part of me feels like perhaps that's because of the confluence of screens that was perhaps driven by everyone all of a sudden being in their homes 24/7 for a good chunk of the last 2 years, where there's still a ton of cross-device usage going on, but where that cross-device usage maybe used to span your house, your commute, your office, the gym, other places. Now it's largely centered on this one environment. And that's given us a little bit more of an opportunity to find the interplay between those different devices. I think Amy alluded to this in her video bubble, finding the synergy. I hate to use the overused phrase, but the synergy between an impression that can happen on the TV screen versus one that might happen on your phone, tablet, or computer.
yeah, I think delivery versus outcomes is not the way to think about it, because I think both sets of metrics are important. I think an advertiser certainly wants to drive a business outcome, but they also are buying something, i.e. they're buying, reach and frequency or a number of impressions. So they want to know, one, that they got what they paid for, and then they want to quantify, did it drive a business result that they're after? And that business result could be, driving awareness, which is top of funnel measurement, or it could be driving a transaction, which is the bottom of the funnel. One size doesn't fit all with respect to defining an outcome. But I think the idea of delivery, that's still going to be important. I don't, not to slam Nielsen, but I don't want to say, hey, I want to go out and reach deliver this many impressions and reach this amount of audience and have an error range that's, plus or minus X%. I want to know specifically, and with like Vizio data, we're getting currency grade data so we can make those quantifications with a lot of precision.
Yeah, George, any thoughts here and how that may have changed since we last spoke?
So 2 years ago, 2020, probably started 2018, 19. We started having the conversations with CMOs, CEOs, and CFOs about the way they were looking at marketing and how they were evaluating the success of marketing. What I mean by that is the metrics, the KPIs, the time horizon. Right, the distance between putting something into market and the expectation of delivery against that investment into the market. And some conversations were great. Carla Hassan at Citi, which is now at Chase, was probably a trailblazer for really thinking about marketing as an investment vehicle that pays dividends over time, and therefore the way you should look at it should be like an investment vehicle, right? It has certain things that will deliver in certain stages, right? Immediacy, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and the way you value it is looking based on how it should be able to deliver in that time frame, not against unrealistic expectations. And then there are certain types of things that it will deliver 9 months out, 12 months out, 24 months out, 36 months out, 60 months out, right? Those are different set of metrics and KPIs, right? So fast forward 2 years, everything that you've seen now from the WFA, IPA, WARC, ARF suggests that more CMOs, more CEOs, and more CFOs are starting to adopt that mindset. I think what the COVID and the pandemic has proven to them is your brand is really where all your equity comes from, no matter if you're looking for short-term gains or long-term gains. And now they're a lot more susceptible to looking at marketing through the lens that it's always been looked at, which is an incremental driver of business, right? Not in the short term, right? Because if you look at it through the short term, you're gonna actually remove away more than 80% of the value that marketing actually delivers back into the business, right? True business growth. The other thing that I've seen, which ties to that, is the change into the type of relationship that we have to look at. So Bob mentioned parts of that kind of journey stage. What I've said to a lot of CMOs in the last couple of years, probably increasingly more now, given my focus in healthcare, where I would argue that they're probably about 3 to 4 years behind the general market anyway, is a different type of relationship that they need to understand. And I'll give you that relationship. Historically, there used to be a relationship called share of voice, share of mind, share of choice, share of market. But what we're starting to realize more and more, it's not really share of voice. There's value in that, but you're not paying for reach. You're actually paying for attention. I can reach 90% of the people. They don't give two crap about what I'm doing or not. They don't give me the time of day. Your most important mechanism, which is your creative message, albeit it needs to be congruent to the channel and the audience. But every research that I've seen in the last 15 to 30 years has all suggested that creative is still the by far the thing that drives effectiveness. A lot more so coupled with media and audience, right, which is that trifecta. But if you update that relationship right now, that equation, it would say, and it should say, share of attention drives share of mind, mental availability, which is what we're trying to fight for, increasingly harder, given all the fragmentation that we have, increasingly so, which will drive share of consideration, share of choice. which will drive share of preference, right? Which is ultimately what the battleground is, right? You want to be first. You don't want to be always third of three, which will drive share of market through sales. That's the relationship. That relationship has been gotten a lot better because of the understanding and the realization that brand marketing really is an investment vehicle that transcends the short-term thinking of a business. Not to say that you don't want to show short-term gains, but that is where brand gives you the ability to amplify your short-term gains, but also makes it a lot easier over time to realize those dividends on a continual basis. So those are the things I've seen, a more willingness and realization that they've maybe thought about it the wrong way in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's interesting. We agree. I mean, I pose the question as, counting versus outcomes. But here at Upwave, we believe that these two things necessarily are interlinked. In fact, more so you can't have one without the other, right? You can measure impact. You can measure how many people, or you can measure the extent to which a campaign is driving awareness of a brand, but how many people was that, right? And that's where reach comes in and some of the counting measures, and sort of the intersection between the two, you actually have a true measure of impact. So we actually believe that there's going to be a big convergence of these two ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I to jump in here, I think George is right. I think there's a lot of space between making somebody aware of a brand to getting a transaction, and maybe we've been Pavlovian dogs about doing D2C with online click-through metrics, that show immediate response, yes or no. But I think, good creative drives awareness, drives persuasion, drives, likability, drives message association. And I think it's an important component. Like I said, one size doesn't fit all in terms of the KPIs or the outcome metrics you want to use. Creative's a critical component to it. You want to get that message that somebody remembers and that message resonates with that person to get them to buy your product. I'm in a cab, I see an ad for Nike. I don't say, hey, turn around. I want to go to the Nike store. It takes time.
Well, that's a great segue into our next topic. I think we always think about direct to consumer to some extent as, bellwether, at least in certain ways. A lot of them, we've seen a lot of D2C marketers kind of rushing into TV, but bringing this digital mindset, across connected, addressable, et cetera. And potentially this mindset of we need to see some direct response and that you should be turning that cab around. What do you think are the implications of this currently?
I really liked Bob's point around understanding the latency inherent in this user experience versus something like mobile. I think we've come a long way and continue to evolve, and there's great opportunities ahead of us in the near-term future to understand ways that we can make the TV experience more like a traditional digital experience within reason. And within reason, I think means scalable and value additive to audiences rather than feeling intrusive or alien. I think that comes down to the form factor of that level of engagement, whether it's directly interacting through a voice remote to your TV or finding ways for your phone to engage directly with your TV so that you can make a purchase potentially directly within the TV environment. But until we're there, I think there has been a bit of a learning curve for a lot of DTC advertisers in terms of coming to the space armed with all the great knowledge and insights and approaches they have that have worked so well for them on other screens, and finding it's not quite a one-for-one, right? There is additional latency inherent from when you see that ad on the biggest screen to when you're taking a purchasing behavior on a phone or a computer. And you need to account for that. And ideally, you can account for that in a way that captures multiple touch points with that audience, not just on the big screen, but on the smaller screens as well. So you can get a sense of what each of those is doing along the consumer's purchase journey.
So you guys don't think that the future of TV advertising will just be QR codes sort of on the screen?
I would like to know how that, there was an ad at the Super Bowl that had that. I forget who the advertiser was. That's terrible. That's point number one. But how that was perceived. Like I was confused by it. It was a 60-second spot with a QR code bouncing around like it was a ping pong game back in the day.
I think it was Coinbase.
Yeah.
Coinbase.
That's right. It was Coinbase. You're absolutely right. So I didn't get a whole lot of that out of that ad.
Yeah.
I'd say to that point, I think it's vital when, speaking about the value additive nature for our consumers, making it feel organic. To me, the low hanging fruit is those types of brands or products or services that are most closely aligned with TV's natural environment, which to date and for the foreseeable future is an entertainment vehicle, a content delivery vehicle. So thinking about ways to further engage with paid content, subscription content, or the types of products and services that might closely align with sitting in front of the TV, like for instance, ordering a pizza for a movie night. Those to me feel like the organic opportunities where we can start to push the envelope. Because I agree, QR codes is something that we're absolutely testing, but putting a QR code up to buy a Gap sweater, for instance, nothing against Gap, is maybe not the right approach at the moment.
Sorry, go ahead, George.
I think what the challenge has been for let's call it native digital marketers rushing into the space that TV now applies is instead of coming with the mindset that they should adjust and adapt to that environment to make sure that you're actually extracting the full value of that environment. They're coming with the mindset is I want to be able to apply all the digital ways of doing things into that environment. And that is probably the biggest challenge. And that's something that if you've been in this industry long enough, and Bob and I have been in this industry long enough to have known.
Hey, speak of yourself. We're not talking about age here.
Experience, Bob, not age, experience. To know that we've seen this before. We've seen when broadcast got splintered out to cable, everybody says, I want broadcast to look like cable. And that was not the benefit of it all. Right? The benefit is let's figure out how to best to use that mechanism for what it's supposed to be intended to use. Not to try to create everything to look like digital, because honestly, that's the biggest learning. And I will take you take any version of measurement. I don't care if it's match market testing. I don't care if it's split cell testing. I don't care if it's MMM. They will tell you that if you force everything to look like everything else, you're actually detracting away from the value that you get.
I think I said this last time. I remember when digital started to take off in 95, 96, people used to come and say, yeah, it looks just like TV or it looks just like print or no, it's very, very different. I think that, it's a balancing act. I do think that TV has, despite having brand friendly, engaged content that people, are involved with, has always been disadvantaged relative to digital from a measurement and targeting perspective, but that's kind of gone. So I talk about this a lot, like TV's never been in a better spot. We're still great content, brand friendly environment, engaged customers, consumers, and now we have data to go along with it. And I think the worst thing we could do is say, hey, I want all the metrics I got on digital. I want to take advantage of that engagement that a consumer has. They're giving, me time, and let's be respectful for that time. It's not like one click and I'm out. They're actually there engaging with the content or attentive to the content. Let's be respectful of that.
Great. Great discussion. So this brings us to the end of our 3 topics that we discussed in 2020. I do want to remind anybody attending, you can ask questions in the Zoom chat and we'll sort through them and pose them. We've got about 20 minutes left. But before we get to the live Q&A, I did want to sort of think through a little bit about this idea of performance versus brand marketing, which is near and dear to our hearts. So kind of thinking through how performance marketers and brand marketers are behaving differently with CTV and addressable TV. Is that performance versus brand bifurcation, is it still real? Is it fading? And has this, like most things, been accelerated through the pandemic?
I have an opinion on this. Everybody looked at addressable, and I'll start with addressable to be a panacea. Everything needs to be addressable. Addressable is going to fix everything. And in fact, it's just a tactic. It should be part of a complete, strategy to reach consumers at various levels of the customer journey. But addressable has a purpose, but it can be a panacea. And I think, CTV is going to be a similar thing. We do get a lot more metrics than we're getting, historically with linear TV. And it's very, very exciting to have that. But it's, not all dollars are going to go to CTV. They're going to have some sort of, marketing mix or allocation work to be done to figure out what do we want to do in linear TV, broad reach, what do we want to do with addressable, what do we do with CTV, and understand how those things all work together. Hey, by the way, I was going to tell an anecdote. So last time we did this 2 years ago, we came out of we were in a basement, we came out, massive super spreader event that it was. And I tried to go to a restaurant and they were starting to close down. I'm like, what's going on here? And that was the beginning of that. And then last night, my wife's in town, we went to a restaurant and I couldn't get in, not because it was closed down, because it was crowded. So it's like, I'm literally looking at this event as these two bookends between the beginning and the end of the pandemic with respect to New York restaurants. It's just a weird circumstance that I'm sitting here answering the same questions I did 2 years ago. I don't know what happened in the last 2 years, whether it was a nightmare or a dream sequence, but what a crazy bookend of these to the last 2 years.
Let me give you the perspective of it's going to start. So the bifurcation between brand and performance still exists, unfortunately. In some areas, it's gotten more exacerbated. I mean, it's bifurcated more. In some areas, it's gotten a lot better, and I will tell you kind of what the catalyst to that has been. It really depends upon the CMO. If the CMO is a business CMO, if the CMO is a true marketer by design, right? And to me, marketing is still about driving business. It's just a specific aspect of driving incremental business. But you are seeing more CMOs that are taking a much more holistic perspective of the utility of marketing. Although they need to show performance gains, right? Still business performance. I'm not talking about clicks, and I'm just talking about business performance. And if they come with that type of background, they've been hired by the CEO, right? And the CEO understands that in partnership with the CFO, then what you're seeing is this notion of the total economic impact of marketing, which then transcends a brand and performance conversation, right? It's not based on a specific point of time or a specific horizon. It's really, how do I look at the value that I'm getting through the continuum? It really, I would say, the biggest thing that I've heard from CMOs, and when I'm sitting with CEOs and asking me, how should I approach this? What should I be thinking about? And I tell them the same exact thing. It depends on who you put in that seat, right? Will dictate the philosophy and approach that you take. And if you put the wrong person, it might set you back a few years, right? If you put the right person, it will accelerate you a few years. Right? And it's a lot of that education and knowledge transfer to get people to realize that they need a different type of CMO than maybe what they're expected to do because of the reasons that I just mentioned to you. So there are pockets that are happening, and it's very encouraging, but there are also pockets that's very, very discouraging, right? That they're moving to the opposite side versus looking at it as a totality. They're still very much fighting internally to the point where they have separate agencies probably even more than separate agencies. I have 3 or 4 agencies, some working on only brand performance and some only working on acquisition performance. And then even within acquisition performance, they got specific companies, agencies working on search, right? So all you look at that is how, there's no way they're leaving so much opportunity on the table. They're actually doing themselves a disservice when you see that type of bifurcation, even within a single brand.
George, I remember you sharing a version of this insight in the first version and wishing I had recorded it so I could put it in front of clients. And I feel that more strongly than ever after what you just shared, because I think there's definitely still that challenge of, from the high level CMO perspective and philosophy down to the nitty gritty of an RFP, how well that's translated. And it's a conversation we find ourselves having pretty consistently is the outcomes are absolutely important. We can and should be measuring towards those. But when we're talking about a situation where a brand new advertiser to a platform is looking to make major decisions on budgets after a week of activity on that platform, right, based on the outcomes they're trying to drive to, it's really challenging to get any momentum going if we haven't been spending the last quarter, 2 or 3 quarters building the upper funnel, right, the overall brand awareness, so that we can then get down to those lower funnel metrics. So still definitely a challenge on our side. It's encouraging to see that more brands are thinking about it more holistically, but I feel like we might have to get you on retainer, George, to have some of these motivational conversations with some of our clients to get them thinking in the right way.
Yeah, and I have something to say about this too. Like back in the day when scanning data came to the grocery store environment, money shifted from TV advertising to trade promotions because they could see how a feature or display drove in-store sales. They couldn't see really the noise to signal wasn't enough to give you an idea about how much advertising was driving store sales. They knew when they dropped a feature or they dropped the price by 15%, sales went like this. So I guess my question to George would be like, how are they quantifying, how are CMOs quantifying brand equity? Are they doing calculations that, yeah, this type of advertising won't drive, weekend sales at a car dealership, but it's supporting the equity of the business and it's going to impact our revenue for the next 2-3 years, et cetera? Is that being done? And what does that CMO look like? Is that an ad CMO? Is that a finance CMO? I mean, you mentioned a couple different types of them.
Yeah, it's I think the biggest thing I've seen, either in direct conversations with them, them asking me to come in and consult with them, or sitting in partnership with some of the consultancies like Ubiquity, right? Because those guys are being tasked more about education and reorganization of the marketing department and what its task is, right? And what its purpose is and how do they go about doing that. What we always land on is the mechanisms are off, right? What you have and why you think you have it and the way you have it structured is off. There's no way they're going to be able to do what you just described, Bob, which is, right, understanding the true value of brand equity. And what we tell them is, and this is where I would say 90-something% of CMOs and CEOs, and I would actually CFOs get it wrong. We ask them, what is your expectation? The expectation that marketing will drive sales? And they're like, yes. Okay, you're not wrong in that. Is your expectation that all marketing will drive direct sales? Is that your expectation, that they will drive direct sales every single time? Yes. Then that's why you find yourself in this position. The vast majority of marketing does not drive direct sales. It drives sales indirectly through the things that drive sales. And when we explain that relationship to them, when we show them that relationship, and that, Bob, you've seen this before. This is not something new. This is something that has been studied for the last 40 or 50 years. The reason we have a lot more information now is we have more of the computer models and we have a lot more empirical evidence that suggests that when you find the relationship of brand, however you describe awareness, consideration, familiarity, imagery statements, and you really quantify the combination of those factors and the sequence of those factors and how marketing influences those, because I say that is the biggest hurdle. It's not how marketing drives sales, it's how marketing influences the things that influence sales. That to me is the biggest battleground in measurement right now. Once we get marketers, CFOs, and CEOs. I will tell you, CFOs are the first to get it, because if you break it down into that language and say, hey, you have a bunch of assets that you invest in, right? When you look at your business, do you look at how each asset directly drives your business, or do you look how each asset influences each other, and you look at it as a totality of portfolio? And they're like, well, no, it's a portfolio. Yeah, exactly. Why would you think this behaves any other different? It's an asset. It's part of your portfolio.
Right.
And we try to get to them from that type of mentality. And once you have the CFO, honestly, the CEO becomes a lot easier to get there, because the CFO says, yeah, this is exactly the way we would study our business, and therefore we should look at marketing through this lens as well. The CEO says, oh my God, I have the CFO on my side, right? Awesome, right? Once you have the CFO and CEO, the CMO is easy at that point, because they're going to be like, okay, so I basically have the territory not to actually act like a CMO, pretty much, right? Now all you need to do is now act like that type of CMO. The reverse is actually quite opposite. When we go to CMOs and like they're very, very frustrated, like, we can't do this, they're my expectation. And we ask them, so tell me how you're approaching it. And they've been approaching it like basically a bull in the china shop. It's only this and it's that, and you guys don't know what you're talking about. And we tell them, I said, well, you're not wrong, but your approach to how doing that is quite the opposite of what your CEO and your CFO and your board members understand about business. Right? So they're not business CMOs, Bob. And I think that's probably been the biggest learning, is you still need a marketer, because it's still marketing, but you also need a marketer that understands the realities of the modern day business. Right? So a lot of the true marketers these days are marketers that have probably gone through rotation cycles. For example, I'll give you one of the best at like Liberty Mutual. There's a reason that they behave very, very well. They put all their employees to a rotational program, every single one of them. And when I start comparing, and we've done this over the years a little bit, to start looking at the organizational construct of how CMOs in some organizations are successful versus not, I will tell you the reason that they are, and therefore the business is successful, is most of them, if not all of them, have rotational programs, mandatory rotational programs.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, George. You know, I think we think a lot about it in terms of the pendulum swinging, right? From either measuring brand or measuring action. And I think the clock runs out on the CMO, you know, in both cases, if they're not thinking about it in the right way. That was awesome. Thank you. And I think as we sort of get to close to closing here, wondering if you guys, you know, thinking again, sort of, you know, knowing we did this sort of pre-pandemic and fingers crossed, somewhat post-pandemic-ish. What would you guys say the pandemic itself changed most about TV media buying and measurement? You know, how do you see this impact today, and or how do you envision this playing out over the next 5 years or so?
Who wants to go first?
I would love to hear what George and Bob have to say on this. I'll just briefly say, I think, you know, related to some of the topics we've already been talking about, for certain hard hit verticals, this was a fundamental shift in how they define success or survival. I think in some cases, to me, there's a really interesting dynamic around fast moving CPG brands and the substitutions that a lot of audiences made or consumers made when their brands were not available on the shelves, whether they're going to be going back to the legacy brands as supply constraints ease. But I think that was an interesting shift that we started to see with those types of brands in how they approach the market, even through supply chain issues when their products maybe weren't on the shelf. I think it really, for a lot of them, underlined the importance of consistent branding, especially when the products aren't available, because if you're not on the shelves and you're not in front of consumers in their hearts and minds, you maybe have lost them for good, or for at least a long purchase cycle. So I'll throw that out as one of the, I think, big impacts we've seen that could have a long lasting effect on consumers' willingness to trial new or replacement types of products versus the existing brand loyalties that may have been built over, honestly, years, if not decades before this.
George, you want to go or you want me to go?
You can go, Bob.
What I mean, the pandemic was a massive exogenous shock to the economy, to people's lives. So, I think, and you watched how employment dropped off the table, and now we're talking about fantastic growth because the year-over-year compares are so different. But I think from my perspective, what marketers have learned is that, oh my God, we can actually do this. We can do this remotely. We can buy TV. People are watching TV. We can still, influence consumers. I think, had I thought about what was about to happen 2 years ago in March when we had this meeting, and I knew that the pandemic was going to do what it did, I would have said, NFW, we're not going to survive this. The economy is going to tank. We're all going to be unemployed for years. There's going to be a dust bowl in the Midwest. I would have thought it was, the end of the earth. But oh my God, we're in a great spot. I look at companies like Airbnb. I mean, they in March should have been out of, or by April, May should have been out of business. But what happened? Consumers adjusted, and all of a sudden, instead of renting houses for a weekend or a week, they were taking it for months and 2 months, and that business, thrived. It did more than just survive. So, my perspective is, we're pretty nimble and pretty adaptive, and we have a lot more options in terms of media delivery. We have a lot more options in terms of how to reach consumers. We have a lot more options in terms of transacting. Technology has delivered all that to us, and I'm pretty blown away by where we are 2 years after what we just went through, how positive things are. And I'm not a positive guy, and George he'll attest to that.
So I think the biggest challenge and the opportunities for television will be how television gets categorized. What do I mean by that? Its categorization right now sits more within what people will call a traditional brand, upper funnel. And the reality of that, television, given the fragmentation that it's had over the years and continue to do so, it actually is a multi-platform environment. And it should be treated like a multi-platform environment where you're investing in that environment, just like a marketing mix. You would have a TV mix. And I'm not talking about broadcast and cable. I'm talking about all the things like a marketing mix in television. When you do digital, everybody says, well, I have my digital tactics. Television now, right, should be talked about just like digital is talked about, where you have tactics that you put together as part of a total overarching strategic plan, right? Because it actually has every single element, but you have to be willing to understand it. And that's probably the other big thing, right? You have to be willing to understand its possibility and potential to help across every part of the journey stage that you want to get to. Then the question becomes is, well, how do I determine what goes into what? And I think that is probably the biggest white space right now is, so which elements do I use when I want to create more attention? Which elements should I use when I need to create more consideration, preference, versus drive more lower funnel or more closer to the sale behavior? Because I would argue that everything that we have in a multi-platform television world these days, we probably have more than we need, honestly, and that's why you're seeing some of the consolidation that you're having, is the recognition that it's no longer a platform television. It's no longer like, oh, I'm going to use television as a single channel versus, no, it's actually a multi-dimensional ecosystem that you should go in there and have a true definition of a marketing mix across all the stages of the journeys. Then you get to the other question, which is, well, how do you prove that out then? So this is with the attempt of MMM, and it still gets it wrong. And then the attempt of multi-touch, which gets a little bit right, but he's getting more wrong. So I think you have to now start revising those methodologies and those approaches to try to answer as much as possible of that. You're not going to be able to answer all of it. There's still going to be a lot of companies that just don't want to play nice with each other. But you need to be in a position where you get enough clarity so you can make confident decisions. Whatever that level of risk that somebody's willing to take, is that 50%, 60%, 70%. That's going to be incumbent upon the industry, the type of brand it is, the type of business that they're in, the sensitivity of what they're trying to do. But I would argue, I still argue, you don't need perfection, right? You just need enough of that clarity where you can get a really, really good understanding of the picture, so you can actually make really smart decisions within television. So I think if we figure that out, we would have now created another step change in many different areas, right? Reclassifying the value of television, reclassifying where television sits within the total marketing mix. And we would have hopefully broke down some of those bifurcations between what somebody thinks about brand and what somebody thinks about performance.
Yeah, and you also inadvertently answered our question from the chat, which is what's our opinion on leveraging and how to use advanced TV capabilities within the channel mix. So thank you for that, and we are at time. So I want to say a huge thank you to both our panelists and our audience for joining us today. We hope this session gave you guys some additional insight into the future of TV measurement. Please keep an eye on your inbox for the recording of the session, as well as any upcoming Upwave events. We do these Masters of Measurement panels quarterly, and then we do webinars monthly. So if you're interested in learning more about how you can leverage the Upwave platform to make your brand advertising more impactful, please reach out to us at upwave.com or send us a note at sales@upwave.com.